With Peter Jennings.
Good evening. We begin tonight with an ultimatum from the United States and a very quick response from Saddam Hussein. The U.S. told Iraq today to pull its troops out of the Iraqi city of Zakko, or the U.S. might force them out. Zakko is in northern Iraq. It's where U.S. troops are building a huge tent city. 600 tents are up. Everything is ready for the first Kurdish refugees to come down from the mountains. But the Kurds won't move in until the Iraqis move out. And so the U.S. ultimatum. Here's ABC's Britt Hume.
Late this afternoon, following a meeting with American officials, Iraq's UN ambassador told reporters his country had, in effect, met the American demand.
Well, the soldiers had already left, and the bulk of the police, yes, have already left, and only 50 policemen would remain in town. And that's to the satisfaction of both sides.
If all the Iraqi forces and most of the police indeed packed up and left the Zakku area today, it will eliminate one of the problems facing U.S. and allied forces there. But they must also finish building a huge refugee camp in the town, as well as another elsewhere in the region. Not only that, U.S. commanders must convince the terrified Kurds it is safe to return to the area, as only a few have done.
I don't know when they're going to come down. I don't know when the situation will be satisfactory to them.
That is but one uncertainty. Another is when, or indeed whether, allied forces will be able to turn this mission over to other organizations.
What I think is going to happen is that the United Nations will step in here, probably taking this thing on a bite at a time, and take over.
But there is no timetable or even agreement on that. Nor is there any certainty that the announced political settlement between Saddam Hussein and Kurdish leaders will hold. In Washington, Bush administration officials were careful not to put too much stock in it.
I think it's better to have the reported agreement in principle on the part of the Kurdish leader than it is not to have the agreement in principle.
And finally, the biggest uncertainty of all, when U.S. forces will be out of Iraq. No way of knowing was the word here today. One reason for that is that the administration is improvising, making up policy as it goes for a situation it didn't foresee and doesn't control. Britt Hume, ABC News, the White House.
In Baghdad today, Saddam Hussein was shown on Iraqi television touring an oil refinery that had been heavily damaged during the war. Other members of his government confirmed today that, yes, there is an agreement in principle with Kurdish leaders to grant autonomy for the Kurds in northern Iraq. The Iraqi premier, Sadoun Hamadi, said Iraq wants to begin a new chapter in its history. Well, if the Kurds are suspicious, it is understandable. They've heard it all before. Here's ABC's Jim Wooten.
These are the faces of Kurdistan, a country that doesn't exist, except in the hopes and dreams of 20 million Iraqis and Iranians, Syrians and Turks who are first and always Kurds, and almost always at odds with, if not at war with, the governments they've never really accepted. For instance, even during this week's negotiations for Kurdish autonomy in Iraq, these Iraqi Kurds were rehearsing their next war against Saddam Hussein. Their last one, last month, drove 2 million of them into the mountains. In fact, 3 previous autonomy agreements have all ended in bloodshed, either because of Kurdish factionalism or Baghdad's brutality. No wonder there's considerable skepticism in the refugee camps and the guerrilla hideouts about how long a new arrangement, if there is one, will last. But Iraq's next-door neighbors don't want autonomy to begin, much less last. The government here in Turkey, for example, is afraid that will only encourage its own Kurdish population of about 10 million to intensify its efforts to be recognized and dealt with as a separate people. For 7 years, the Turkish army has been fighting Kurdish separatists in these mountains. And for longer than that, Turkish Kurds have been second-class citizens of the country, the focus of government repression and military hostility. Moreover, in a poor country, the Kurds are the poorest of the poor. Still, they are fiercely proud and still insistent that they are a separate tribe, Muslims, but not Arabs. Not since the Crusades have they won any of their many wars. Instead, as they have for centuries, they still work the soil of the Middle East, from Syria to Iran, down the Tigris into Iraq. These citizens of Kurdistan, a nation of the mind. Jim Wooten, ABC News, Cizre, Turkey.
The State Department says the first American relief flight to Iran will take place on Saturday, a U.S. Air Force plane carrying thousands of blankets. The U.S. hasn't had diplomatic relations with Iran since the takeover of the U.S. embassy there in 1979. Some U.S. aid has reached Iran through private relief organizations, but never has there been any directly from the government. In a moment, the other news. Computer hackers in the Netherlands stealing military information from computers here. On the American agenda tonight, where to put the nuclear waste. So many Americans say, not in my backyard. We'll also have a report on an unusual breed of goats.
This is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings, brought to you by